In the lexicon of the English-speaking world of the 21st century, there are few words that have caused more confusion, consternation, and all-round kerfuffle than these three. Actually, no, not those three. Although also those three, but I meant these three. As words go, they're pretty broad stroke, especially when used in regard to politics, the workplace, or education. However, the manner in which they have perhaps become most contentious lately is when used in regard to modern entertainment. So let's take a look at them, shall we? So, first things first, so that we know what we're talking about. What do these words mean in and of themselves? Well, Old Miss Oxford English Dictionary saith thus: diversity, different in character or quality, not of the same kind, unlike in nature. Inclusion, the action or act of including, the fact or condition of being included. Representation, bring clearly and distinctly to mind, especially by description of imagination, the fact of standing for or in place of another. So, now that we're all wiping our asses with the same piece of toilet paper, so to speak, let's stick a pin in those words for now and ask, to tell a story, obviously, but more than that, so we can view the world through another's point of view, so we can sample the emotions of another person struggling through events in which we may never find ourselves, which in turn allows us to confront similar feelings without the dangers inherent of actually being in those situations. So vicariousness, if you like. Hold on, wasn't he a character in a Game of Thrones? Anyway, fiction can also be allegorical, which Miss OAD defines as a story, picture, or other piece of art that uses symbols to convey a hidden or ulterior meaning, typically a moral or political one. However, most, if not all, fiction is made in the name of escapism itself, the definition of which being to seek distraction or relief from reality. So what makes a successful piece of fiction? Well, for any piece of fiction to fulfill its raison d'etre, it needs to be believable. Believable, I hear you cry? I don't believe in zombies or monsters or aliens or wizards or the French. Well, by believable, we mean it should make sense, i.e. follow its own logic within the fictional work's own structure or set of rules. Because any work of fiction is a covenant between the creator and their audience to engage in a little willing suspension of disbelief. Therefore, we, as the audience, accept right from the beginning that Star Wars is set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Or that there's a medical department within a hospital somewhere in New Jersey where a doctor only diagnoses cases that, in reality, would only show up in 1 in a billion people. Or that a rural town in Surrey, England, has a murder rate of the combined United States. We suspend our disbelief willingly in the understanding that the creator strives to make everything around it believable. For example, a doctor named House could actually diagnose rare diseases by sarcasm alone, and I'm pretty sure that's how he did it, but if a Gregory House were to pop out of a portal from the future and tell him the diagnosis, we would immediately nope out. Because we didn't sign up for a science fiction show, we signed up for a medical drama. And medical dramas must follow a certain set of rules. Those rules being what is available or conceivable in the medical world at the time period in which that piece is set. The same applies for fantastical works based on historical settings, such as steampunk or the world of Tolkien. These stories must be created with rules in place conducive to the time periods in which they are set or based upon. Were Gandalf to have blown the crap out of Sauron using an electronically powered particle disintegrator, we would have felt cheated, and our suspension of disbelief would have been shattered, because despite the existence of magic in the world of the Lord of the Rings, it is clearly based upon a medieval time period, and therefore any technology must respect that to make any sense. What we're really looking for in a work of fiction is authenticity. And a successful piece of fiction should also ensure that you care about the characters, at the very least, the main protagonist. So, what makes us care about a character? Well, a character doesn't have to be heroic, human, or even very likeable for us to care about them. We root for the lead characters in Breaking Bad, Dexter, and The Godfather, not because we condone their actions, but because we are shown their reasoning of how they justify their actions to themselves. And by understanding why they do the things they do, we find ourselves caring about what the characters care about. Likewise with Woody from Toy Story, or Dumbo, or Winnie the Pooh, or that green frog thing in The Mandalorian. None of them are even human, but we care about them. Why? Because we recognize their struggles. We don't want them to fail or to be hurt in the same way that we wouldn't want anyone we know in our own lives to fail or to be hurt. Quite simply, it is because we empathise with them. So, what is empathy? Well, Mrs. OED tells us that it is the power of mentally identifying oneself with, and so fully comprehending, a person or object of contemplation. Empathy is the vessel in which we place our feelings about a character, either real or imagined. If that vessel has holes in it, or it isn't even there at all, our feelings spill out all over the place and we just end up not giving a shit. Empathy is what makes a wealthy young businessman identify with a poor aging grandmother. It's what makes an 8-year-old girl identify with a grumpy old pensioner. And it's what makes a melanin-rich female from Barbados in the 60s identify with a melanin-poor farm boy from Tatooine in his teens. And it's what allows anyone and everyone to identify with a cartoon deer called Bambi. Okay, so let's take that pin out of diversity, inclusion, and representation now, shall we? When it comes to fiction specifically, is representation a desirable thing? Well, we can all agree that it's a good thing to have a variety of opinion and experience and social and economic background in the creation of a piece of entertainment, can't we? And we can agree that we want to include as many people as we can in the creation of a piece of entertainment, can't we? Or can we? Would we want people who are not versed in the background of a project's subject matter to be involved? Would we want people who would struggle with the amount of work necessary involved? Would we want people who have no creative aptitude at all involved? Would we hire a painter who couldn't paint, a chauffeur who couldn't drive, a pilot who was afraid of flying? Not if we wanted the end result to be a success, we wouldn't. Therefore, isn't the choice of who we collaborate with on a creative endeavour exclusionary by definition? Maybe. But perhaps we aren't talking about diversity of background and skills when we talk of diversity. Perhaps we simply mean the diversity of identity markers. So then a project would need to have some redheads, some brunettes, a couple of blondes, and of course 1 or 2 people without any hair at all. But what effect would that kind of representation have on a piece of work? How does having different hair colour make a difference to, well, anything at all? Well, it doesn't, does it? No more than the pigmentation of skin, the profile of a nose, or the shape of your eyes. Cultural diversity could be useful, of course, where relevant. An Egyptian's input might prove invaluable if you were making a documentary on, say, Cleopatra, for example.
Hello? Hello? Anybody home?
But how about diversity in the finished work itself, so that everyone feels included and represented? By breaking humanity down into representational chunks, we are separating ourselves based on our most superficial differences. Let's take Tolkien's Middle-earth as an example. What kind of representation is needed in the writer's room for a Tolkien project? Well, we might opine that all the writers must have read, understood, and have a positive appreciation of the books of Tolkien, and that they have a burning desire to create or adapt his world to appeal to A. Tolkien fans, that is, after all, why you've purchased the rights to Tolkien's work in the first place, for the property's built-in fan base, and to B. appeal to as many people as possible who might not yet be Tolkien fans. Now, following this criteria, would there be any benefit at all in ensuring that 2 of the writers are melanin-rich, 2 are attracted to their own sex, 1 isn't sure what they're attracted to, 3 hate their current political leaders, and half the total at least identify as female? Now, it is important that none of the writers should be excluded for any of these things, but of absolutely no importance whatsoever that any of them are these things. Or do we think that because somebody has more melanin content in their skin, or because of who they love, or the clothes they wear, that these people are fundamentally different in their thinking somehow? Because that would sound very much like the foundation of an ism. Now, even if the intention is a noble one, by implying that our superficial differences are important enough to be lauded and held up as noteworthy, we are in actuality creating differences where none exist. Western society has struggled for decades to take the stand that we should not be defined by our melanin content, nor by the brand of our clothes, not our economic status, not our geographical location. We are not defined by social class. We are not defined by our religious beliefs. We're not defined by who or what we rub our genitalia against. We are all human beings within the human race, defined only by our thoughts and by our actions. When a story begins, the door to inclusion is opened by the creator by default. All anyone has to do is to step through that door, and the hinge upon which that door swings is empathy. The ability to identify with the human condition and its myriad struggles is what inherently includes us all. The definition of empathy being, remember, the power of mentally identifying oneself with, and so fully comprehending, a person or object of contemplation. Therefore, if a person can only identify with someone or something that looks just like them, or dresses like them, or has the same sex as them, or supports the same political party they do, then they may very well have an empathy deficit. And lacking the fundamental human ability to identify with another human's struggles, unless they are a de facto representation of themselves, is what we call having a narcissistic personality disorder. Inability to empathize has led to a lack of authenticity in our entertainment. We are so desperate to feed the narcissism of seeing ourselves in our own entertainment, a byproduct of the selfie generation no doubt, that we are inserting characters into our stories that challenge our audience's willing suspension of disbelief. Let's revisit our Tolkien example. The Rings of Power added a melanin-rich elf and a melanin-rich dwarf into the show. Why were these characters added? Did their skin colour add anything to the story being told? No. Did it harm the story being told? Arguably, yes. Why? Well, Arendelle was an elf, and Tolkien has specifically stated that elves were pale or white-skinned. Now, he didn't say there weren't any melanin-rich elves, but being that elves all came from the same place, they must have all once had the same skin colour. So for an elf to look like Arendelle, he would have to have been A, very young, B, from an isolated and procreation-rich group who, C, lived in a hot climate for approximately 10,000 years. Or he could have been a second-generation half-elf. But he wasn't. The same could be said of the dwarf. Living underground does not necessitate the production of melanin in the skin. It doesn't make sense, and it is therefore inauthentic, which breaks immersion by taking you temporarily out of the story, which is a failing of any kind of fiction. There just isn't the kind of generational displacement about in Tolkien's Middle-earth that would necessitate that kind of melanin diversity. No explanations were offered for such notable departures, and as such, for anybody remotely interested in the source material, it challenged their suspension of disbelief. And for what gain? Middle-earth is not 21st century London, and it is inauthentic to treat it as such. Complaining about the lack of the depiction of the melanin-rich in Lord of the Rings is akin to complaining about the lack of Caucasians in the Chinese Sun Wukong myth. Having melanin-rich people peppered throughout the inhabitants of a medieval European setting is as inauthentic as having a police drama set in modern-day New York staffed only by Native Americans. Yes, it could be possible, but there better be a bloody good explanation for it if you don't want your audience to immediately nope out. Melanin content and physiological differences are historically down to the necessity of the environments migrating peoples found themselves settling in. So stories set in or based on the environments of these historical times need to reflect this to be authentic, and thereby aid in the audience's suspension of disbelief, which in turn aids the absorption and thus the power of that work of fiction. As it is, it would seem that entertainment in the 2020s is being made to resemble a United Colours of Benetton advert, by people who can imagine no further than the world they accidentally notice through the window whilst desperately trying to catch a look at their own reflection. Many ethnicities were being under or misrepresented in much of the media of the 20th century, so is there a way in which we can make sure our entertainment is diverse, inclusive and representational? Absolutely. If we focus on authenticity, the diversity and representation will take care of themselves. And if we create stories with characters whose struggles we care about, be they of whatever sex, creed, or colour, they will be inclusive by dint of our innate human ability to empathise. Who these characters are would matter, not what they look like. And isn't that the direction in which we want to go in? But to do this, we would have to accept that we are all one people, and superficial physical, religious, and political differences are merely ripples upon the surface of the very same ocean. And ask yourself, are you capable of doing that?